Hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us once again in our series of videos where we dedicate some time thinking over our nature, our the things with which we are born. And today we'll be talking about non-judgmental, the non-judgmental attitude, non-judgment, which is an expression that is extremely used within mindfulness and mindfulness-related topics. Now, this is something that is extremely important and probably in these, what we can call now, almost a tradition of a few decades. Nevertheless, a tradition on mindfulness applied to health, where we talk of the idea of non-judgment, and it appears right in the beginning, right at the start, the first attitude you must take when you're going to practice, or when you're going to think about yourself, when you're going to look over anything, is being non-judgmental. Then you have several branches there. Being judgmental can also mean bearing some prejudices, and then some prejudices about mental states we have. Certain emotions we consider reproachable. We look down on certain feelings we have. We feel extremely bothered by situations where we think we have failed, we have been, we have deceived, we have disappointed, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about this judgment, we have to take into consideration certain things. The first of all is that it can be very difficult, actually extremely difficult, to choose between two possibilities. And that's something that is very strong in our experience. Sometimes deciding, choosing, can be very hard. The more important the decision, the more difficult it can be. The more filled with consequences it may be, the more difficult it becomes to choose. Hegel talks about dialectics, and he introduces in the field of philosophy and human thought the idea of something being of a dialectical movement for our thought. When we migrate from one thesis to an antithesis kind of stuff. Now, that is very beautiful. That's very nice in scholar environments. But now in academic situations. But when you think of our daily lives and our day-to-day, our menial feelings we bear on our day-to-day chores and attributions, then it's a bit sophisticated. We can come down and look at it in a more human, simple way. It can be difficult to choose, and it can be especially difficult to choose when we strive to be fair in a given situation. And that's something very extremely challenging for those of us who have children, who have had children, more than one. Sometimes you have a sib pair dispute. And it's very difficult to be fair in deciding whatever you decide. Usually you are disagreeable to both. You don't have one that comes out satisfied with what's going on and the other one is dissatisfied. Usually both feel they have been unfairly treated. Now, in our subjective world, now coming away from the objective world and coming into what we have in our subjectivity, in our inner experience, that part of experience we do not share, not because we don't like to share things, but because it's very difficult to reach and also very difficult to be put in words. You have psychotherapy models, several psychotherapy lineages, which deal precisely with the fact that it is not easy to bring out, to flourish your subjective nature and your subjective aspirations. Within the idea of being judgmental, it's completely different than being judgmental to being self-judgmental. Now, this self-judgmental is about approving or disapproving whatever goes on in our hearts. We must recall that from an ethical point of view, it's very different to what I do. What I feel does not always turn out into a linear, into an immediate consequence in an act. Now, what I act, the things I do, these do, yes, change the direction of things. But the things I feel, not always. So there is there's a very different look upon what I feel to what I do. There is a chasm, there is a gap, a lag between the two. So being judgmental is something totally different to being self-judgmental. And being self-judgmental is completely different to adopting a sanctimonious, a holier-than-thou attitude, a mushy attitude toward ourselves, being condescendent. It is a different logic altogether. There is no need to be dialectic or even judging about ourselves. Why? Because to be even judging, to be equanimous and all the rest of it, is usually to do that about something which is outside of me. So I hear about a crime, or I hear about a situation which goes to judgment, and this judgment is public. You know these TV shows, and all the details of the crime start being depicted, and all the opinions start being collected, and you have this, and then you can be equanimous or not. But it's something that's outside you. It has nothing to do with what you are, what you do. You might identify yourself to a couple of things, but it's not your life. It wasn't your hands. It wasn't your brain. You didn't see it with your eyes. So there is no need to be dialectic or even judging toward ourselves. And then there is something else also. When we are thinking about ourselves, we have no need to conceal anything. We can be honest with ourselves. There is no consequence to it. So I can be mushy, I can be silly, I can be noble, whatever kind of thought, whatever kind of memory, whatever kind of idea can cross my mind. Still, no one knows it. I find my workmate handsome. I find my workmate beautiful. Still, it's with me. And no one needs to know about it. I don't like certain kinds of attitudes. I don't like certain kinds of clothes. My friend loves them. I don't need to necessarily tell him I don't like your style. You can keep it to yourself. That's not being hypocritical, and that is not being a liar. It's about being private, about having privacy. And mindfulness and meditation is something we deal with in absolute privacy. So after a practice, people are invited to share whatever they experienced. Obviously, they're going to share things that don't hurt their privacy. In Portuguese, we have a word called pudor. I really can't find an equivalent in English, but it's something like you have a filter. You take care what you let know about yourself to others, in respect to these others. In respect to these others and in respect to yourself. The cultivation about the non-judgment of the contents that go by, cross our mind, is the shortcut, the unavoidable path toward loving thy neighbor. And then you say, but there's a jump here. Yes, there is. There is. But when one becomes non-judgmental, equanimous, accepting whatever goes through his mind, this makes it easier, and it's almost an automatic slip into being more tolerant, into being more embracing and forthcoming toward your neighbor. Because loving thy neighbor, it refers less to an emotional display or a personal preference, and more to the ethical idea of treating him as you would like to be treated yourself. You know that famous passage in the New Testament where it says, you love God above all things, and the rest of it. And then the second commandment that is very similar is, love thy neighbor as yourself. And the first step to be able to accept your neighbor is to be able to accept the flaws. Here, flaws with this sign here. The supposed flaws, or the parts of you, or your thoughts or your feelings that don't match what you would like to think of yourself. This is the first step to understand that your neighbor probably has similar conflicts, and he may be imbued of the honest intention of doing his best. So his flaw may not be something he thinks is beautiful, or his flaw may not be something he is aware he does, because that's what you're doing. When we practice, we are becoming aware of ourselves. Isn't that it? Isn't mindfulness the awareness that rises from paying attention in the present moment in a non-judgmental way? No. It's about awareness. Isn't the curriculum of mindfulness awareness? So your neighbor might not have the same, he might not be aware of what bothers you. And you might be right. He might have a very bad habit. He might do things that are very noxious, that are very toxic. Yes. Still, when you accept your toxic attitudes and aspects, you tend to be more human and more humane toward your neighbor. But someone might ask me, might say, listen, different people might have different expectations about how to be treated. They might have different goals, and they might have different values, and they deal with life in a different way than I do. So how am I going to treat him or her the same way I would like to be treated? That's true. That's one huge question. But the deeper sense of this reflection will be addressed futurely. Yes, it's true. We have that. But here we are talking much more about the universal shared humanity we have. The better, the kinder we treat what goes on in our heads, the kinder we become to our neighbor. And that's about equanimity. That's about non-judgment. That's about being a more pleasant and a more agreeable person toward others, especially facing adversity, especially facing the undesired. That's the time that our awareness is most needed. Thank you for watching us. Don't give up on yourself under any circumstances whatsoever. And thank you very much for your presence here.